which has organized this lecture series. And then I've asked Ted Cullinan to introduce Sir Dennis Lasdun. Michael?
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the trustees, my fellow trustees being Nicholas Dennis, John Dennis, his son, and Nigel Paddington, his lifelong partner, I welcome you to the 11th Memorial Lecture. Although it's not my task to introduce Sir Dennis, I feel it's proper to draw attention to the fact that the 11th John Dennis Memorial Lecturer has something very special. He has that anyhow, but as far as this evening is concerned, he has the fact that he is a British born and bred architect whose career, a very distinguished career, has been largely shaped in this country. That is not in any way to disparage the previous 10 lecturers, but it does make it interesting that we have a lecturer who actually knew John Dennis, not all that well I believe, but I'll say something about that later. And in fact, John Dennis, as many people here will know, as I see many of his friends and former students around me, belonged to the very best of the EAA's tradition. That tradition in which it was actually founded, in which a great number of people got quite a lot from it, but also gave even more back. A tradition which I'm happy to say not only preceded John Dennis, but also followed him, and that is why here we all are, in a survived AA, and one in which he played a considerable part. To have spent 27 years of your life devoted, as he did, to the AA, and at the same time be part of an architectural practice is something of a record. And he went through the whole gamut of student, teacher, student, administrative staff, then teaching staff, then member of council, and finally, in one of the most traumatic periods of the AA's history, there have been others, he became the president, and at the time I was his vice president. I think that our lecturer tonight has included the word recollections in the title of his lecture. And what is more appropriate to a memorial lecture than recollections? And as I was also on the staff here, and indeed succeeded John Dennis in one of the posts he held, I can to some extent imagine what he might have felt about the immense changes that have taken place in the 15 years since his sad death by an accident in 1973 in public perception of architecture, which is so different that I don't think he would really believe it. And I feel that although I can't be certain what he would think, he probably would have been somewhat enigmatic about it, and I think would have been rather surprised that Vox Populi and Royal Obiter Dicta now actually match one another, and has made life somewhat difficult for architects. But what he would have been, I'm absolutely certain, very proud of, and very proud to have been part of, and even to have created, was the fact that the AA, through these very curious years of public unity and of public concern and so forth, let alone the infinite politics that seemed to go on around architecture, he would have been very pleased indeed. The AA kept its cool, has survived in all this period, has overcome and not even troubled with some of the more trivial pursuits of other places. I say no more, but the fact is that here it all is, to stimulate ideas, to encourage imagination, and not, as many people have said in the newly formed appeal fund, as a testimony to it, but not to introduce doctrinaire attitudes and encourage a particular fashion or a particular discipline. And that, we hope, will continue to be, as I'm sure John would have hoped, his lasting aspect of this place. Now, in these years when he was on the council, and I was on the council, and many people present here tonight were on the council, I cannot really go into the detail, and maybe Ted Cullinan will say a bit more about it, but the truth is that there was an amazingly divided AA. It wasn't just a question which one might expect of the staff versus the students or the students versus the council. It was much, much more complicated. And solutions had to be found, and some unity had to be found out of an immensely difficult situation. It took its toll of John Dennis. It took its toll, no doubt, of many of us who sat with him. But in the end, in spite of the difficulties, it was resolved. And in John Dennis's own time, Alvin was appointed, and the school once again passed through one of its bigger crises, and it's still here and doing well. I have to say that at that time, and I say this because I know a new appeal is coming, there was no money from government of any colour whatsoever. I say that hastily to show how neutral I am. And there was a division among everybody else where money should come from. Now, I asked Sir Dennis whether he could remember very much about John Dennis. He did remember one thing. He remembered the pipe. And I must say, I remember the pipe because we were both excessive, absolutely excessive pipe smokers. And students of Jung and Freud can make what they like of the fact that he smoked Parson's Pleasure and I smoked something called Three Nuns. But no decision was taken without a cloud of pipe tobacco smoke, and I think perhaps it helped us to survive those difficult years. Now, finally, on behalf of the trustees and the donors to this trust fund, I would like to thank not only Alvin and Edward Lemestre for their work, but also the work of their colleagues, because it's very easy to forget, for trustees particularly, to forget that people have to do the detail. The detail has been very well done for 11 years, as it has been tonight. And on behalf of the trustees and donors, I would like to thank all the staff who took part in that. Finally, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Ted Cullinan, who, although it makes me feel rather geriatric, I have to say was a student here when John Dennis and I were on the staff, and who did indeed know John Dennis very well indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm your chairman, and it's difficult to know, as a chairman, what actually to do or say, since I imagine you all came here to listen to Dennis Lasdun give the annual John Dennis lecture and not to hear the chairman waffle on about various aspects of John Dennis and Dennis Lasdun. So I'll try to be brief and to the point, so as to let the main point of your all being here get underway. The lecture is named after and is given to recall the immense contribution that was made to the Architectural Association by John Dennis during the years roughly between the Second World War and the start of the chairmanship of Alvin Boyarsky. In the latter part of this period, the AA went through some extremely hard times. It had great financial problems. It had, with the agreement of the AA Council, Margaret Thatcher, in an earlier guise, had been party to the removal of student grants for AA students. The place had lost its nerve and had sought to join Imperial College, who had turned it down roughly for being too democratic. And it had so lost its faith as to regard this rejection not as the excellent challenge that it in fact turned out to be, but as a fatal and undermining criticism. And throughout this period, John Dennis loved and supported and worked for the AA and its school, and it is extremely fitting the annual lecture should be his and should be given by another man of great integrity, Dennis Lasdun. I was taught at the AA by Dennis, and I worked with him on his schemes for Christ College in Cambridge and the University of East Anglia during the 60s. And after that, in the true spirit of the practice of architecture as a fellowship, he introduced me to my first substantial private commission. Incidentally, Dennis was the man who taught me the thing that all of us have to learn sooner or later after finishing our studentship. That is how much you have to do, how long you have to do it for, and how hard you have to do it in order to do something well, or in order to do a halfway decent building. But much more importantly, Dennis taught me by example and by talk the priceless precepts of a certain kind of modern architecture. The precepts beautifully illustrated by the deserted ruins of Ginsberg's flats of the 1920s that overlook the empty, in every sense, new American embassy buildings in Moscow. Those are those wonderful buildings that were recently completed, but were thought to have been bugged so thoroughly by the Russians that they're not able to be used. And above them on the hill are Ginsberg's magnificent block of flats of the 1920s. I stood in those ruins last June and remembered that Lubetkin worked with Ginsberg, and Lasdun worked with Lubetkin. And here we are today, more than 60 years later. He is still advancing that priceless tradition. Take, for example, and I'll give only one example of what I mean, the Royal College of Physicians in Regents Park, one of the few great buildings of any period in the British Isles. Amongst many things, it is primarily, as I see it now, four things. It is somewhat abstract. Though having local symmetries, it is an asymmetrical composition of black and white forms which create spaces between themselves, as well as being a completely clear collection of forms in their own right. It enshrines movement and supports it. From the moment you are set down at the door, the building encourages and frames and supports the essential movements through it. It creates connected spaces that heighten the experience of use. It is unsentimental. It doesn't hark back to the past or indulge in pastiche or pretend to pompous templehood. But it is nonetheless a serious and an important institutional building. And finally, most amazingly, though abstract and modern and itself, it nonetheless sits perfectly in the historic surroundings and the other kind of architecture of Nash's Regents Park. It does so partly by being black and white on a green base, like Nash's buildings are, but mostly through a combination of scale and the sizing of its parts and the spaces that it creates between its own object-like self and the frame of the surrounding buildings. At a time when many people, afraid of the present, are clawing their way back to an imaginary past, the Royal College of Physicians is a great example and a lovely thing. And it is therefore for me a pleasure and an honour to introduce its author, Dennis Lasdun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted, very much. After that wonderful description of the college, it will be downhill all the way. I'm delighted to be at this most important and most independent of all schools, which welcomes and always has welcomed equally anarchists, the fashionable, the unfashionable, and more or less living architects such as myself. And I certainly remember with much gratitude the pastoral care that this school lavished on me when I was a student. And I remember in particular two teachers. Rowse, my principal, who shocked me from thinking about architecture in terms of style and said architecture is a social art, it requires a commitment to society, and that technology is the tool for which you will use it for to realize it. Those were quite heady statements in the mid-30s. And the second teacher was Rowland Pierce, a very fierce Beaux-Arts sort of neoclassical architect and a great teacher. He alerted me to Lutyens, not the outside of Lutyens buildings, but the important connections that go on inside his buildings, the corridors, the lobbies, etc., etc. And he, of course, because of who he was and what he did, he instilled into me all the Beaux-Arts devices of axes, vestibules, grand staircases, scenographic movement through buildings which Ted has referred to, lessons which I have never forgotten. And in answer to the awful questions which students bombard teachers with, he said, go away, measure a building and make a drawing of it. I measured the orangery of Hawksmoor in Kennington Gardens. Later, I worked with Wells Coates, with Fry, and above all, with Lubetkin, who had a profound influence on me and was without question, is without question, the greatest architect of the period, certainly up to the 50s, that this country has known. I learnt from him a classical attention to the organization of space and detail in support of it. Furthermore, from all three of them, I learnt the immensely laborious process that serious buildings involve, how to scale down complex relations in a program, reconstitute them within the more limited language of the architect's own vision. But that was very long ago, light years away from the fast fuse situation that we have today, flashy perspectives, and build it. Today, however, is where we are at. And today, it would appear that the word confusion does come up a lot, and certainly the modern movement has lost some of its confidence. But the real dilemma is that we do not wish to destroy our past, and we don't want it to destroy us. Confusion is not debilitating, not a bad thing. At least it has freed the modern movement from dogma. And therefore, in my opinion, it's not a bad moment, and I hesitate to say this because I can see great faces in the audience who know exactly what I'm going to be talking about and know it better than I do. It is a good moment to refresh our understanding of three strands in architecture which I think, certainly as far as I'm concerned, are important. The first one is to talk about tradition, ancient tradition, and the living tradition. Ancient tradition affects all architecture at all times. The living tradition affects all of us today. Knowing about tradition is, alas, not enough. Architects all have their own mythology, what they believe in. And when the day of accounting comes up for buildings, it is their myth, their baggage, what they believe in that accounts for why the buildings are the way they are. So I shall be talking a bit about, it's a bad word, myth, but I can't think of a better one. Something called, which I call the notion of cities as inspiration, architecture's instrument. And the corpus of work, which I'm going to show you, flip through very quickly, is an attempt to activate that myth, to show by buildings was there any substance in the myth or not. And that, of course, is for you to judge. And last, because it's in the air, all the time, every day of the week, the word classicism. 3 weeks ago, in the Times Literary Supplement about them, I heard for the first time that there was ironic classicism, latent classicism, fundamentalist canonic classicism, and God knows what else. The end of my talk, I would like to tell you what classicism has meant to me. Ancient tradition. A leaf out of Vers une Architecture, the first book I was ever given to read of Corbusier's. mistranslated in its title as towards a new architecture. It didn't say that, it said towards an architecture. The chapter was headed Architecture, Pure Creation of the Mind. And he had these astonishing words to say about the Parthenon. I had actually, as a student, heard of the Parthenon. He called attention to its brutality, its intensity, its utmost sweetness and delicacy, and its strength. It does rather suggest, doesn't it, that he, the greatest exponent, bar none, of the modern movement, felt that the past had some kind of legacy which could be reinterpreted. The person, I think, who's done a lot of justice to explain this procedure of looking at the past was T.S. Eliot, and I'd like to read you a little passage. Tradition cannot be inherited. If you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, and the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of literature has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Not one of the masters, Wright, Asplund, Corbusier, Mies, Aalto, Kahn, ever turned their back on past tradition. What they did do was to try and reconcile the paradox which exists between a deep desire for a renewal of things, of architecture, and a great affection for the past. Each one of them underpinned their language with classical discipline, and their works throughout the world still, whether they were innovatory at the time or seminal at the time, touched deep levels of tradition, and they are being criticized today correctly, extended correctly, transformed correctly by younger generations throughout the world. It is a living thing, the ancient tradition, and in that sense, history is a feedback and a process of forward thinking, feedback for the future. Next. Next. The slide, I sometimes put a slide on, but I'll tell you why it's on a bit later. I think this century is unique in having established an honest, coherent, non-historical style. It got us off the treadmill of classicism, classical architecture, if you like, and Gothic. It is a tremendous achievement and barely 100 years old. And it didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from Brunel, from the engineers of the 19th century, and Paxton, from Webb, Voysey, Letherby, the arts and crafts, from Cubism, from the Bauhaus, where Klee taught. And what they tried to do was to find a new energy between things and to reorientate tradition, not throw it away, but to reorientate it onto a new axis. It also emerged from Charles René Mackintosh, one of the great visionaries of England. Next, and it emerged next, and it emerged from one of the most primal signposts of the whole of the modern movement, the Maison Domino, which Corbusier originated after the war to repair villages in Flanders. And the important thing about that diagram, which you know backwards, I'm not going to waste your time on it, he had it on a mantelpiece standing next to the Parthenon. It is the most seminal diagram, as seminal as the Parthenon was to Greece, as the Pantheon to Rome, or Chiswick House to the Palladians. Look at it for a moment, joggle the floors in and out, fatten up the columns and put lifts in, put dire grids under heavier slabs, and like it or not, you've got the National Theatre. But of course, I'm not here to preach that nothing changes. Of course we have to have change. There are shifts in sensibilities, in patronage, in how we put things together. We all want to change, but we're not too sure what to. The most optimistic note that I can give you is to turn to the young. They, the ones who interest me at any rate, are seeking out continuity both with ancient and living tradition. They are busy creating new vocabularies around a cluster of new social requirements. They are exploiting technology not to make things similar, but to make them more varied, more colourful, more life-enhancing. And they certainly understand that style comes from a building which does its job well and exemplifies good ideals, relevant ideals. I have never understood the argument which says that because we live in a pluralist society, we have to have 57 varieties of architecture. We have a perfectly good non-historical style which owes nothing to previous styles, and it can offer great variety. I believe the living tradition is vital, albeit a vital one, albeit subject to transfiguration, and it is quite absurd to pretend that nothing of architectural relevance has happened since the Battle of Waterloo. I always carry around with me a little saying which was written at the same time by Goethe. The more one understands the true character of old buildings, historically and critically, the less is one inclined to follow their form when creating new buildings, a form which belongs to a past period. The present fashion, this is 1815, is motivated by a false desire to recreate that which one admired under totally different circumstances. Next, as I said in the introduction, knowing about tradition, either ancient or modern, is not enough. Every architect requires some bulwark of certainty to keep him going through all the pressures that are sort of around to stop him doing his best. And I call this the myth. The myth, and I'll come to the slide in a minute, which I know you're more interested in that, is a set of ideas, not a fable, not untrue, but it's the baggage that we carry around with us as architects and believe is what we should be doing. My particular myth, as I've told you, is cities as inspiration and architecture as instrument. And this was prompted by Letheby, who said if ever we are to have a time of architecture again, it must be founded on a love for the city. 3 or 4 days ago, I can't remember the time, my wife and I were in Paris and went to La Défense. I'm telling you this because I want to try and suggest how the mechanics of this myth work in reality. And here is an example on a very grand scale, admittedly. And he came out of the Défense, up onto the piazza, or whatever it is, and was absolutely astonished. A mile away is the Louvre, in the middle, the Arc de Triomphe. And I looked again, as you will be looking now, and you will note that that arch is not at right angles to the piazza. It has been shifted 5 degrees on 2 counts, I suspect. The first one, that when you first come up at it, you do not see the whole block, you see the evidence of the arch, because it is based on a very banal, ordinary program of government offices which are on the 2 sides with the roof on. That's all it was. to have had the inspiration to do this is one thing. He tilted it at 5 degrees because 1 mile away he is echoing the Louvre, which is also turned through 5 degrees. And then I looked again, and I thought it's well put together. Whatever criticisms one may have of any building, this building has, to use a terrible word, a kind of a pedigree. And I'm not surprised. A great admirer of Corbusier, this architect, trained by Aalto, alas, died, and was head of the School of Architecture in Copenhagen, Otto von Speckelsen. Next. That shows, in my terms, the effect that the city had on this piece of architecture, which I consider a work of genius. At a more modest scale, architecture's instrument, as I've had to practice it, and most of us have had to practice it, is rather like darning socks. We don't usually get a mile of a city to play with. We get a bit here and a bit there, and most of my search is filling in. Some of the holes are quite big, but on the whole, darning holes in an old sock. Spaces between buildings, parks, rivers, network of paths, focal points of memory, and platforms for comprehending the nature of the city are all part of the rich mosaic of what a city is. I don't have a pointer, Alvin. Or do I? Yes, I do. I beg your pardon. It's been, of course, now a battlefield. Here is the battlefield, the South Bank. As you know, Festival of Britain, GLC, House of Parliament, St Paul's, Waterloo Bridge. Some of the slides will be around here. And I'm fascinated with the sort of grain of cities, and I find it more interesting to try and absorb the nature of the city and then respond using architecture as an instrument than trying to search for some sort of new face, some sort of new style. So I reach a conclusion that the architecture, my architecture, for what it's worth, is concerned with extending the city, with extending human relationships, and the buildings which you're about to see are about buildings which are related to other buildings that may be close in space, although they may be far off in time. I do not make stylistic concessions. I do, on the other hand, try to engage with history. I'm not going to bore you with a room-by-room anthology of all these buildings. I'm going to flip through 12 of them fairly quickly, and they are on the theme of the myth, cities as inspiration, architecture as instrument. Next. This is in the 50s, a rather old slide, barely visible. Block of flats in Green Park. You can see the evidence of the section 2 to 3. 2 on the right, 3 on the left, twice. The scale being amplified near Vardy Spencer House on the right. Early trial of relating, I suppose, what you might call modern architecture to the old. I was giving a crit at the AA, and on the wall was a project dealing with this area, and I noticed Vardy's building hatched by the students, but I also noticed this one hatched by the students. And I said, what is the meaning of this? They said, well, we regard it as an ancient monument. So, of course, time is passing. It has already passed. Next. The Royal College of Physicians Ted has given it so eloquently. There's very little for me to say or need to say, except I'd like to tell you about the interview in which I got the job. It took place in what they call the census room in a building in Trafalgar Square opposite the National Gallery extension and looking at South Africa House, Baker. And I was asked, there were 6 architects interviewed, I was asked to go up to the window of this room, which had Wren paneling in it, look out of the window, would I do a building like South Africa House if asked? And I said, No. Now today, same interview, I'd have given the same answer, considerably slower, and would not have got the job. However, it is a building of consequence, great consequence, to me and my colleagues. It is a turning point in which we begin to examine this myth. And next, its disposition on the site shows the main building at right angles to the frontage, with the low-lying lecture hall to the right, the Nash terraces on the right, forming a kind of a space, a court, which has now become a precinct. But in the days when we did it, there was a dividing wall along here, which has since been removed, and it is indeed now a medical precinct, the college having bought the adjacent property for their own use. So new institutes, the Royal College of Physicians is responsible for the medical standards throughout the Commonwealth. And so in the Nash Terraces there are simple little offices, they cross the precinct and they use all the facilities of the parent building. And I'm going to take you for a very quick walk through here, looking out there. The library is up above you, up above here rather. The main hall, which is rather interesting, is here, and the dining room is there, and that room with Wren's paneling is sticking out on the right. Next. The section, front door, thinking of Rowland Pierce, there's a little sort of glazed lobby, slightly higher, squashed a bit before getting into the great space. The great space was described in the programme as the usual staircases, etc. And had they been able to read drawings, it would never have been built. It contains a staircase, and all around the hall, the portraits, the history of the college. And when they have an international conference here of 15 to 2,000 people, it isn't the set pieces that matter, it's the chatting on that staircase and the spilling of glasses of sherry, the looking at the portraits and general conviviality that matter. So that, to keep it shorthand, I call this, as many other architects call it, a processional route. This is, in a way, Pierce talking to me through time. Going through a building is not going from A to B. It is a scenographic experience which can either make you happy or not happy, but it should never be ignored. During that walk, you go up that staircase, which is facing onto the censor's room in the middle with the red paneling, next, and you turn facing Harvey. Seen the other way around, there is the stair, there are the galleries with the portraits, that is the red paneling, and you get peeps out beyond all the time from the building, not through windows so much as apertures. Next. And this is a peep. Next. And there is what I call the fourth wall, looking out to the Nash terraces beyond, which is now a precinct. Next. East Anglia University, which Ted and I worked on with my colleagues. I think they were great days, Ted, don't you?
I do indeed.
Good. Better say that. It was an amazing commission to be given, the idea of a new university. And one of my mentors was Henry Morris, who you may remember did Impington College, brought Gropius over here, and I said, what in God's name do you do about designing a university? And he simply referred to me to a writer, historian I suppose, I've never heard of him before, Rashidal, who says that a university is simply a question of relationships. Student to student, student to teacher, teacher to teacher, and that all spatial relationships can be organized to suit those relationships. Now we're dealing in the 60s with a new generation of young people, better fed, better housed than previously, even better educated, but very independent, young people who wanted to make their own ethic. So colleges, halls of residence were rejected in the briefing, and they were delivering the housing of the students in these terraces. There were 12 study bedrooms per floor and a breakfast room on the front. And the teaching, all we searched for in those days, was not to have a temple of science or a temple of humanities, but to say that all disciplines simply required either a small room, a medium-sized room, a big room, or a specialist room, and we wrote it in a great way. Of course, nothing like that's been built, but bits of it, enough to make it a sort of archaeological fragment. Next. Today, 25 years later, that is a very flattering photograph. After all the agencies have ruined and nibbled at it, it looks roughly like, if you're close in, like a sort of medieval citadel, except for, of course, Norman Foster on the left, Arup somewhere to the right in the music school, Fielding and Mawson somewhere in the middle. Can we go back one? I was saying there's a library, Fielding and Mawson, it doesn't matter. Library, university. But there is, as you can see, a sort of route which holds the thing all together, a kind of a ceremonial route, if we can call it that, which descends gently to what I romantically used to call a harbour, that great space in the middle. And it is still there, just, but it does give coherence to the whole thing, or a bit of coherence. Anyhow, it's an academic city, in my view, on a site rising about 70 feet and about a mile and a half from the middle of Norwich. Next. Next. Christ's College, Cambridge, that have come in for a lot of stick for all the wrong reasons. The students' rooms. I was very, very interested in my very early days with a shop called Derry and Tom's. It had garden and cherry trees on its roof, and I always liked planting. So there's planting over the lecture halls, over the common rooms, and you sort of work your way up the processional route and peel off at the various rooms, took the cars off the road and put a car park there, and then there were shops underneath making a gesture to the road. I thought it was quite civilized, but it did cause a great deal of flack of destroying some rather ropey bit of old Cambridge, I thought, but there are. Next. This shot is taken of general view, and the shot that comes next is up here, and that is a mulberry tree around which Milton wrote his poems. And the students, I think, call the building Milton's Hilton. Next. Next. There they are, the dear little things, up on the terrace. And each of these rooms has a private little space where a boy and a girl can have a moderately private glass of wine together. Next. To the battleground. National Theatre and Opera House, before it was axed, opposite the Shell building. I quite like it still. It was, again, using platforms which I have used in the theatre. There were cafes, shops. This was the theatre, that was the Opera House. There had to be a wedge of nothingness in front of Shell because they had the rights there, and there was a little piazza there. I think it could have developed into something very interesting, but I was alone in that thought. The opera was axed and the theatre moved downstream. Next. And here it is, Waterloo Bridge, Somerset House, the theatre, IBM taking the place of the Opera House, history in a way slightly repeating itself. The Riverside Walk, a kind of a mall, I wanted to see it surrounded with housing. That hasn't yet come. That was in the original report. And attached to the bridge like an umbilical cord. I'm not going to take much of your time on that. Next, section through the theatre, the river, the riverside walk, and the platforms gradually going up, and the Olivier, which was studied, the Olivier Theatre, before there was any knowledge of a building at all. We worked 2 years with all the intelligent people that there are in the theatre until we got it as they wanted it. Of course, the new lot would like to do something else with it, but not on as far as I'm concerned. What I think is interesting is a reverse role that's going on. You go to the Olivier and you see Hamlet, you also see each other. And then comes the interval, and you go out onto these foyers or onto the terraces, and you become the actors, and the city, the magical view of the King's Reach, becomes the backdrop. Next. The language, well, there it is, concrete. Fashion has turned against it. Fashion is irrational. What we get is people enjoying themselves, that a theatre is a theatre, and that's what a theatre is about, and it only has to be pretty en passant, in my view. The platforms relate to antiquity. Platforms were the first organised space for holding public meetings or ceremonial events in history. So the theatre uses that as a theme. Next. A view of Somerset House, magnificent facade by Chambers, but facades are not the only device in architecture. Cretan palaces don't have them, ziggurats don't have them, Barcelona Pavilion doesn't have them. You don't have to have a facade, but of course if you want one you can have them. There are no rules. Next. I talked a bit about extending human relationships. Well, the clinch in the middle, that's doing it. Next. In the end, as you approach from upstream, you can see that the building in that picture, at any rate, looks like an extension of the bridge. You can't see it in the no one. Next. And there it is, an architecture without facades, layered, like geological strata, I suppose. And that's my way of seeing it as an extension of the city and joining the theatre to the everyday world of the life which it supports. I want you just to note before the next slide the position of the Olivier here and the Lasdun. Yeah, that's the procedure. Next. For those of you who can't read the caption, it says, actually, I quite like the National Theatre before the Prince said whatever he said. So my epitaph here is that I rather like pure form, as Clough said, the poet, nakedly displayed, and all things absolutely made. Next. Competition for Genoa, the placement of the Carlo Felici Opera House, bombed or shelled with only the pronaos standing and a colonnade here, and a rather splendid galleria joining it. Next. The brief, that's the Galleria, the brief to make an opera house for 2,000 people for pop concerts and all that sort of thing, and how to recreate that bit of city. Next. And the way it has been recreated, there is the pronaos, there is the Galleria, and the opera house has been turned to an angle in order to make a rather large public space which then connects through to the gallery. Next. And there it is in full composition, the gallery penetrating the Opera House, and the public who want to just go from A to B do it through there, and the public who want to go to the Opera House go up a stair or lift and go that way, seeing the public who are not going to the Opera House beneath them. And the pronaos, the front door of the original Opera House, was there, and this chap, the pronaos, gets a new lease of life as the gateway to the whole thing. Next. And that's what it looked like. Next. Competitions are very dicey, very expensive, very time-consuming. This was our entry for the Bastille. The Bastille, Place de la Bastille, the various opera houses, the modular and the main opera house, and we had a sort of joining underneath going onto a barge where there was stuff going on. But what I thought was interesting was this glazed arcade canopy, which would be the foyers, shops, illuminated at night, very, very lively, and giving a magnificent, I thought, panorama of the city beyond. A sort of people's rallying point, it was seen as, with the Opera House as an urban theatre, again, a backdrop. And when I was doing it, when we were doing it, I thought of somebody else at the EAA, because this blue, which is just a diagram, is a glass enclosure. And there was a teacher here whom I knew slightly, but not very well, called Arthur Corton. He used to go around preaching about glass. And he used to say, es ist da und es ist nicht da. You can see it, and yet you can't see it. And I get quite interested in that sort of way of doing things. At any rate, it didn't find favour with the jury, and so I'm in favour of bringing back the guillotine. Next, the diagrammatic illustration of the elevation with the Place de la Bastille on the left. Next, religious buildings and Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock, an Ottoman synagogue here, a little passage, and all this was destroyed after this photograph was taken. And just over here, yes, you can just see it, the minaret of a little mosque. I like the idea of religious buildings. I'm not too worried which one it is, but I like them because you don't have any complicated functional requirements like pipes and all that sort of thing. You do have liturgy to study, but that's not quite as bad. And throughout history, religious buildings have given architects the opportunity to explore space in response to a universal idea. Next. The drawings are done by a young architect called Crispin Ride, and they are really very beautiful in their real state, not as a slide. The mosque, that little passage, you enter through a little hole in the passage, and other little buildings here which in a way become grafted on to the new building, which comprises 4 pairs of hollow towers, 4 apses. It's all very tiny. This is only for 300, less than 300 men, with the women's gallery on the top, the sanctuary, and the men's porch. An entrance to a community centre underneath, which is lit through a depression in the ground, following the geometry which is set by the angle of the mosque, and quite different from the position of the synagogue, which has been built in exactly the position that it was originally. Next. The section showing that depressed part, an earlier 13th century building underneath, and the section, rather simple, very small, roughly just a little bit bigger than the surrounding buildings, but not much. Next. The cross-section and the towers are used to ventilate the building using the cool air at night by convection coming up the building to cool it during the night without any mechanical means. Next. View of the space that was left, which I saw as a marketplace, to be buzzing with stalls and everything. The new building next. And a doodle in a way which sums it up, that it should be something that arises out of the little bits of the city that are already there. I'm in good company because Palladio always saw his churches simply as an embellishment of the city, an extension of the city itself, in fact. Next. None of those three will get built. This one slipped through the net. This is the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg. It is to EEC what the World Bank is to America. And the entrance quadrant is here, and the restaurants here, and the conference centre is there. I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about it. It's very, very difficult. I don't want to tire you out. But it's on a beautiful corner of a very undistinguished area. But the beautiful corner is on the side of a ravine where Vauban did his military engineering in the 16th century or 15th century, I can't remember which. Now the brief was extremely interesting. No air conditioning to be allowed at all windows to be openable, and everybody working in the building must have a view of the landscape. So the cruciform plan establishes the presence on all sides. It draws the orbit of the site right into the heart of the building, and you never see it at all in its entirety. And I would like to walk you again through another one of these processional routes. I'm rather hooked on them, really, because they hold things together in planning. And we're going to look at the entrance from here, come through here. This is when the building was just finished. They hadn't put all their hideous portraits up, all the rest of it. It's very bare. And there's a big hall here leading you down to the conference centre. And I thought it would be quite nice to put a water garden, assuming it didn't leak, over the area where the finance ministers would be meeting several times a year. Next. The entrance. Next. That hall leading down to the conference centre and a gallery above. Next. A view from the gallery of the water garden beyond. And you'll note that you cross a little bridge here from the main building to get into this pavilion that actually sits in the water. Your feet are below the level of the water. I thought it would keep everybody rather calm while they went cap in hand, hoping to get millions of pounds for the creation of roads, both in the EEC and other parts of the world which the European Bank deals with. It is a very enlightened organization, non-profit making, and gives long-term finance for developing countries. Next. Water garden seen from the outside. Next. And the last scheme is down to earth, back to London, and into commerce. This is a block of offices, deep training offices, going up at the moment near the Barbican. Ropemaker Street, Chiswell Street, Whitbread's Brewery, and an island site And the disposition shows a roof which could have had, under a different disposition, shops, etc. around it, and a circular drum in the middle which contains all the lifts of this office block, which isn't very high, about 6 or 7 stories. But I'm interested in it because it's a new situation for me. Working, certainly we have a client, he's the developer, but we don't know who is going to go into that building until it is let. And this poses a situation which I think is quite interesting and well worth exploiting. Next. The section shows that drum which contains the lifts coming down, pinning the building to the ground and ending in a moat of water. And you cross by bridge to the other floors. Plant rooms are in these roof spaces, and I want to just discuss a wall, and it's a cavity wall. And it's a theme which I call order and freedom. Next. The order belongs to a half-inch thin line of glass, frameless, tinted, solar, whatever it's called, and with etching on it where it stops being blinded by the sun in different solstices. You can walk between that and the inner cavity, which is on a modular grid. And the point of it is that the order of the building remains constant. But if you choose to go in this office and have 200 foot of blank wall for a cinema, or half a wall with no view out, you could fill it in with a kit of parts. But whatever you do is going to play a visual game with the outer skin, which is transparent. Although it's tinted, you will see the light going on in the building. And in between is a chimney. And the chimney deals with all the requirements of heat loss and heat gain. Next. The model, diagrammatic model, clearly echoes resonances, I think, of Mackintosh. It's Castella, slightly Castella in feeling. Next. It's concerned with edges, bays, corners, not cut corners, going round them, silhouettes and skylines. Next. And we're nearly at the end. Bear with me for classicism. I'll come to this slide in a minute. Classicism, for me, with a capital C, means the full apparatus of classical language. Columns, capitals, orders, but above all, the rules which govern how they are distributed in a building, including systems of proportion. I like classicism with a small c, and classicism with a small c is what lies behind the rules of classicism with a big C. It demands an understanding of the network of human and formal relationships out of which architecture arises. It relates buildings to buildings, buildings to people, and to the natural world. It absolutely demands rational procedure, to quote Summerson, that you have to understand people's wishes and needs. You cannot ignore them. And that it does demand some kind of integrity in the planning organization of the building. It isn't a case of anything goes and nothing goes very far. And it does require some feeling for proportion. Not a mathematical proportion, but a gut kind of proportion which we all have. We all know when something should be up on the right or down on the left. and Wren had a very good name for it. He referred to mathematical proportion, but he also referred to customary proportion. And a very important director or chairman or whatever they're called at the EAA, pardon me, Alvin, principal, was Jordan, Fernand Jordan, who said, and in addition to that, you need something else called, and he called it, the tertium quid. I don't quite know what it means, but it's what makes your toes twinkle, to quote Dylan Thomas. The most difficult aspect that we all face today, and which distinguishes us totally from the past, is the scale of our operation. And how to deal with human scale is still a puzzle which we're all thinking about. Now, I must just take 5 more minutes of your time to explain Epidaurus and why it's on the screen. Because he was a very, very good architect, the bloke who did it, Mr. Polykleitos. And I'm going over those 4 statements as seen by the ancients. Rational procedure. He was the first architect to steepen the rake up at the top so that people could see properly. The festivals used to go on for 14 days with their women and their donkeys and God knows what, and there are 20,000 of them here. He hollowed the seats out so that they could tuck their feet in comfort. And if you think you can put a compass point in here and strike an arc and get to there, you'd be much mistaken. You get to there. And then he says, right, I'm moving the radius out to there by 3.5 meters so as to widen it up. And now why did he do it? I can only assume that he did it because he wanted to relate people not only to the drama that was going on, but while the drama was going on, they should be aware of the city beyond throughout the whole performance. I don't believe that classicism, as I've now defined it, inhibits anybody's invention. All I know is that the more I loosen my grip on classicism with a small c, the more whimsical the work tends to become, unworthy of this century altogether. So what I'm trying to say is that when the rational is combined with the emotional, then the abstract ideas which we've been talking about become concrete, and even a deconstructivist could benefit from a dose of that. Next, and last, my favorite picture, architecture without architects, if you like, just people making a jolly circle, the band playing. It's the fundamental tendency of the human race to create some kind of 3-dimensional space or place, even without any formal training. So, to paraphrase Dr. Johnson, I think I've told you the truth, more or less, given my opinion sincerely, and it's for you to disagree.
No, Alvin, please, give away.
I was simply going to tell everybody that if they are staying on for the banquet upstairs, that they can proceed in the next few minutes to the library with Ted.
I sort of got up in the ungoverned moment at that point. You know that Hawksmoor lived for a number of years after Wren and Vanbrugh had died. practicing energetically. Nicholas Hawksmoor fell into a certain amount of disfavour among fashionable circles and royal disfavour of a temporary nature towards the end of his, not towards the end of his life, while he was still hale and hearty. But despite the disfavour and despite his difficulties, they had to get him back to do the West Towers of Westminster Abbey and a number of other buildings because nobody else knew how to do them. And I would like to thank Dennis with that comparison with Nicholas Hawksmoor. Thank you very much.